We are bringing you the second part of our two-part Q&A. Ask me anything for this weekend, the weekend of, what is it, the 23rd, 4th, and 5th, 22nd, 3rd, and 4th, or something like that. So we are doing our, as promised, our second live stream Q&A that'll last for about an hour, where I answer all of your questions, social studies related, history related, social sciences, geopolitics, both past and present. It's what we do every weekend. We've been setting it up for the last couple of months, where we basically do 3 live streams. We have Friday evening at 8 p.m. Start your weekend off right with some history. Drop some comments, topics, questions in the chat, and I will get to them in a timely manner. Then we follow it up with another round on Saturday evenings, earlier in the evening, so that everybody can go and party and enjoy themselves afterwards. And then Sunday afternoon, our live stream lecture is at 4 p.m. Eastern. That'll be tomorrow, and we will be talking about the history of Ellis Island, which I didn't get to in last week's live stream lecture, where we had a great talk about the Cold War. I also be discussing the history of Thanksgiving a little bit, as well as, of course, the life and legacy of the 35th President of the United States, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, whose assassination anniversary just passed this past Friday. And if you want to learn more about that, go ahead and watch my This Day in History videos. I upload one every day. I have one from yesterday covering Kennedy's life and assassination, as well as a daily passed away video for historical figures. I also did one yesterday on Kennedy as well. So go ahead and watch those, learn a little bit more about his presidency. And I have a series on the U.S. presidents with a longer form video, about 4 or 5 minutes, discussing the life, legacy, and impact of JFK, one of the nation's most foremost and important presidents. And so today we will be not talking about that. We'll be talking about that tomorrow. So if you want to learn even more about John F. Kennedy and his interesting and transformative presidency, which was known as Camelot, be sure to join us tomorrow, 4 p.m. Eastern, to learn about the roundtable of the Kennedy family and JFK's life, legacy, and how his assassination has become a huge part of American history as well. And I'll be discussing the history of Ellis Island and the importance of American immigration, both past and present, as well as, of course, a little bit about Thanksgiving, which is a teaser for a special we are doing on Wednesday, the day before Thanksgiving here in the United States. I will be doing a special live stream where I will be live stream lecture, probably a little shorter, where I'll be discussing the history, impact, and legacy of the Thanksgiving story, how it has become more of a legend than a historical fact. And hopefully you will join us for all of that. I will be doing that Wednesday at 7 p.m. Eastern Time. So really looking forward to that. Simon is returned. Welcome, Simon. Great to see you. And yes, today is the birthday of Otto I, who might have been the first Holy Roman Emperor who ruled over Germany in the late 9th century, late 10th, early 11th century. Really one of the most important figures in German history, one of the greatest leaders in German history, Frederick Barbarossa, Charlemagne, Otto I. These are some of the giants of the Holy Roman Empire in its early days in the 9th, 10th, and 11th century. So check out I have a little video about that. I update daily biographies and birthdays, so check those out as well. And Taylor, it's great to see you as well. So for the next hour or so, I will be answering any questions or topics you want to talk about pertaining to history and social studies. It's what we do every Friday evening and Saturday evening here on the Friendly Neighborhood History Channel. It has become a tradition of ours to do 3 live streams. It used to be only 1 on Saturday afternoons. Then we transitioned as the channel kept growing and people wanted ask more questions and wanted live streams to go longer. We added Sundays, and now we moved it back to Fridays and Saturdays so that Sunday I can talk about topics, because I always had preloaded topics I wanted to do for each Q&A, and I never got to them because everyone was always asking such great questions. So, hello, Russian Agent, good to see you. Ooh, Caravaggio, good to see you as well. I think I put 912 in the shorts. I'm pretty sure I put 912, Simon. Welcome to the AMA. This is what we will be doing for the next hour or so. Any topics, questions, comments, historical things you want to bring about, be sure to bring them up. And it was 812, never mind. So be sure to bring them up. You know what? I'm going to go and redo the video then and re-upload it, and maybe that'll be a little bit better. But yeah, any historical topics, comments, questions you have, that's what we always do here, and that's what we really enjoy doing here on the Friendly Neighborhood History Channel, bringing you relevant historical content, the lessons from history to historical topics, a bevy of whole things. And if you want to become a Friendly Neighborhood Historian, it's as easy as liking and subscribing. Tell all your friends and family, and you are officially a Friendly Neighborhood Historian. There's no process where you have to pay or donate or anything like that. There's no Patreon, at least not yet. I'm doing this all free of charge because during the week, you guys hopefully are watching and enjoying my historical content, shorts and long form. And the weekends, this is a chance to give back to you, to teach on Sundays, and to take questions and comments on Saturdays and Fridays. So I really, really enjoy it. So Relevance of the city of London. Caravaggio is asking, hey, Mike, good to see you. Yeah, London is obviously really important. I believe it is the largest city in population in the entire world, it or Mexico City. It is one of the most ancient cities. It is over 2,000 years old and is one of the most important cities in European history and, of course, in world history, because you have the seat of power of first the Kingdom of England, and then Great Britain, and then the United Kingdom, then the British Empire, and now back to the United Kingdom, keeping its domicile in many ways in London, whether it be the palaces of the English kings and queens, or it be Downing Street, and of course Parliament, who really, for now, for all intents and purposes, runs England and Great Britain and the United Kingdom. So basically, here's a great quick breakdown on it and how it works, so that no one is confused. And I have often gotten criticized for this, but there's several different terms that are used to describe England. England is a strip of land that covers the largest section of the island of Britannia. The Romans conquered this region and called it Britannia in the 1st century AD under the Emperor Claudius. So because that land was called Britannia, Britain and England have been used synonymously and interchangeably, and England has been the predominant and most advanced civilization on the British Isles for the last probably about 2,000 years. However, that doesn't take away from any of the other areas on the series of isles or on the main island of Britannia. England has been the largest section of Britannia, but you also have to the west descendants of Latin peoples who fled when the Romans abandoned the island in 410 AD, and they eventually assimilated with the local barbarian tribes, the Celts, that were living there, and that became known as Wales. And so you have Wales on the western tip of that island, and you have England kind of in the middle in the south. In the north, you obviously have Scotland, which has always been delineated because the Romans were not able to conquer what they called Caledonia, which is why Caledonia was the name of the Scottish colony. So the English had 13 colonies on the Atlantic seaboard, but the Scottish actually had a colony in what is now Panama that never went anywhere, and they called it New Caledonia. It's a real thing. Look it up. Scotland has always been a separate and distinct entity from England. Its culture is different. The barbarian tribes known as the Picts, who settled that region, were different than the people who lived than the Celtic tribes that lived in England. So a very different group of people. Eventually, Scotland was integrated into the English kingdom and sphere of influence. In 1603, Queen Elizabeth I died, and her nephew, James VI of Scotland, became James I of England. So there was, for the next century, the ruler of England was also the ruler of Scotland as separate political entities. Then in 1707, after that Caledonia thing failed and fell apart, England and Scotland decided to sign what was called the Act of Union, which created Great Britain. Scotland became part of England after centuries of being distinct from England, although the Scottish people obviously to this day consider themselves extremely different and extremely distinct from the English people. But there you had England and Scotland united. In the 1300s, the English had conquered Wales and integrated it. Actually, it's the 1200s. Prince Edward, who later became King Edward I, Edward Longshanks from the movie Braveheart, which is also about Scotland, he conquered it as the heir to the throne and became known as the Prince of Wales. So that is why the Prince or Princess of Wales is the title given to the next in line for the throne. So right now, the British have King Charles III, and his heir is Prince William, the Prince of Wales, of Kate Middleton, who is the Princess of Wales. And York, being the second most important city behind London, that's why the Duke or Duchess of York is a title formerly ascribed to Harry and Meghan, the second in line for the throne, and his spouse. So London was actually, we go back to the Romans, London was built by the Romans. It was not an ancient Celtic city, and it was built in about 47, 46 AD as a settlement along the Thames River that they could use to control the southern part of the island. And so London, from that, became a central city, along with Camnidium, which became known as Colchester later on, for the Roman control of England. And because it was Essex that was one of the provinces in England that was able to, its rulers were able to, I'm sorry, Sussex, not West. Am I getting my Essexes confused? There's Wessex, Sussex, and Essex. The Anglo-Saxons conquered England, and so there's the land of the West Saxons, Wessex, South Saxons, Sussex, and East Saxons, Essex. There's no Nessex. There's no Northern Essex. But basically, they have London was set up as the principal city, I think, for the Kingdom of Sussex. No, Kingdom of Wessex, that was able to eventually conquer all of England, and then eventually England conquers all of Wales, and then eventually incorporates Scotland. And so London was always the premier city. It was the largest city on the British Isles for centuries. It was the largest city in England for centuries. No city came close. By 1600, London is the only city with over 100,000 people in all of the British Isles, and that includes Ireland, which I haven't even gotten to yet. But Ireland is basically a distinct entity that the Romans never even tried to conquer like they had Scotland. It was called Hibernia, and it was eventually proselytized into the Catholic faith by one Patrick, St. Patrick, where we get St. Patrick's Day, in the late 300s. But Ireland remained a distinct entity for centuries, and the English and the Scottish both tried to conquer it at different times, and there was a lot of warfare and rebellion. And it wasn't until the 1640s, under the leadership of Oliver Cromwell, 1650s, under the leadership of Oliver Cromwell, when the British actually kicked out their monarch for 10 years, that Parliament was able to successfully incorporate Ireland, conquer it fully, and incorporate it into Great Britain. So now you have the makings of what became known as the United Kingdom. England, Scotland, Wales, and Ireland are all the United Kingdom. Great Britain is England, Wales, and Scotland, and England is just England. It doesn't even include Wales. So that is the distinction that has been made in the delineation. Now, I have sometimes used them interchangeably, and I've gotten a lot of slaps on the wrist from commenters and people who give wonderful feedback for using them interchangeably. But to me, there is some level of ability for us to talk about England being the premier country that conquers Wales, Scotland, and Ireland as this is the English, and the English are in control. Or talking about the British Isles, including Ireland and the Isle of Man, which is a small island between the middle of England and Ireland that the British conquered. So, and of course, you have not the Irish or Scottish or Welsh or even English Empire. You have the British Empire with the English at the helm of that. And when we think of Great Britain, we typically think of English culture and identity, and less so of Welsh or Scottish identity. And we see Welsh in particular as a subset of English, where Scotland and Irish is particularly are seen as distinct. And of course, in 1922, Southern Ireland becomes independent. It's the first colonized area other than the 13 colonies that gets its independence from Great Britain. It's the first one to do so in the 20th century, but it won't be the last, as the British Empire falls apart after World War II, and all of its regions in Africa and Asia, particularly India, go free. Australia and Canada decide to govern themselves. All of that great stuff. So that is, so in all of that, now that's a long and detailed explanation, Caravaggio, but in all of that, London has remained the premier city in the British Isles. It has always been the largest city, it has always been the most industrialized and advanced city, and it has always been the seat of government for the English. And ever since the Romans made it into their foothold, it has been, as one of their two biggest cities, it has become more important, especially since Wessex was able to, from the seat of power in London, with kings like Aethelstan and Alfred the Great, the only English king to ever receive the title of Great, have been able to conquer all of England. Since Wessex, governing from London, was able to conquer all of England, which included Sussex, Essex, and Mercia, and the land of Northumbria, the northern part of England, where York is. And from there, that became the nation of England, that was later able to conquer Wales, Scotland, and all of Ireland, and now retains political control of Wales, Scotland, and the northern part of Ireland. London has been the most important city in all of the British Isles. It doesn't mean there's plenty of beautiful culture and refinement in Scotland and Glasgow and Edinburgh. There's York, there's Colchester, there's the cities in Wales are beautiful, but they're very hard to pronounce. The Welsh language it always ends in Ellen or Llewellyn, and it has a bunch of consonants and very few vowels. Its language is particularly different from English and Scottish and Irish. And of course, you have Dublin and Belfast in Ireland, which are extremely important cities as well. But London has always been the largest and the most important city in the history of not just England, but I would argue all of the British Isles, and I would argue all of the British Empire, because it was from London that the East India Company started to extend its claws and tendrils into India and Africa. And you have, obviously, the British influence The Americans, when they're doing their revolution, they are sending their complaints back to London. Benjamin Franklin actually lived in London for almost 20 years as a representative of colonial interests in Parliament. So there's a lot of going on in the city of London, and it's obviously an extremely important place. And yes, Dublin, I forgot, they are called the Brightons, not always the Celts. Thank you, Melissa. I very much appreciate that. I did keep my Yes, thank you, Simon. Historians tend to be the most handsome. Real women date historians. What am I going to say? But I tend to keep my personal life very. I've had people ask me to get married on this live stream. We've had all sorts of crazy stuff happen there. Yes, in Dublin, you were right. Southeast England is the closest to mainland Europe, which is quite interesting. Yes, historical questions, historical topics. That's what we're going on about. Yes, Ireland, the land of the Gaels. Obviously, the most distinct, I would argue, culturally because of its land separation and being another island from England and the British Isles. So a lot of people take exception to when I say the British Isles include Ireland, but I'm also including the Isle of Man, and I'm remembering that Northern Ireland is still under political rule by the English, so by the UK. So that's part of it. And the UK is used more and more commonly these days to refer to the lands that are not Ireland, that the British and the English have owned: England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland, and the Isle of Man. Let me see here. And let's say if you like looking at me, you'll see me in tons of videos and content that I post up. So please like and subscribe, and you become a friendly neighborhood historian. I appreciate your compliments. It's very sweet. Make the most of it. Great to see you. I'm always glad that you're here. King Athelstan, the first king of England, consolidated the foundations laid by his granddad Alfred, the father Edward. Yeah, you've got like three great kings there. Obviously, everybody knows Alfred the Great. He's the only English king who ever received the title of the Great. He not only defeated the Vikings, but forced them to basically split England between what was called the Danelaw, which was this eastern region in Mercia and Northumbria, and he got all of the Essexes, Wessex, Sussex, and Essex. And he is the first English king to really stand up and formidably defeat the Viking incursions. Starting in Lindisfarne in 793, which was a monastery where the monks were always busy preserving ancient manuscripts, giving to the poor, and basically keeping the lights and the knowledge and the information of the ancient world alight, going in what was usually called the Dark Ages, which is a misnomer. But anyways, the monks were always alive in monasteries, keeping learning and all sorts of knowledge relevant. But at Lindisfarne, there was Farne in northern England, there was an attack by the Vikings in 793, and this begins the Viking Age, where the Vikings were consistently attacking Europe, and since England was its own island and closer to them in Scandinavia, they typically went into England and attacked England. Now, for centuries, a group called the Angles and the Saxons, the Anglo-Saxons, I am speaking English, England, that's where we get all those names. The Anglo-Saxons in the late 5th century had taken over the island of Britannia and basically asserted their dominance. And then the Vikings came centuries later to upend the Anglo-Saxons, and they conquer England at several different points. There's even a Viking empire that ruled over England in the 11th century called the North Sea Empire, where the king of Norway was able, there were three, Canute the Great and Haffa-Canute. And I'm trying to remember the other one. Was it Harold Bloodtooth? Something like that. Those men were able to rule over England and incorporate it into their kingdom a couple of centuries after Alfred. But what made Alfred great was not only did he encourage the learning and the discovery of the monasteries, not only was he one of the very few English kings to be at that time who was able to read and write, not only did he strengthen England's borders, fortifications, he built up their towns and villages, but he also is the first English king to successfully repel Viking invasions and not just let his land get ransacked by the Vikings. Now, the Vikings would keep coming back, as I just mentioned, with people like Canute the Great and the North Sea Empire. But Alfred, then his son Edward, and then his son Athelstan all consistently were able to hold back the Vikings and establish more and more control over the lands of Mercia and Northumbria until Athelstan, basically in 927, is declared the first English king. Although that's been debated that the first English king goes back to the early 9th century, nobody knows. Obviously, you have the legend of Arthur, who was probably an Anglo-Saxon king who conquered most of England in the early 5th century. So stuff like that. Yes, please like and subscribe. Thank you, Simon. We are trying to get to 6,000 by the end of the year. We're at almost 5,500, and I always appreciate all of the great feedback and support I get from my subscribers. But a legion of friendly neighborhood historians sounds amazing, and becoming a friendly neighborhood historian is as easy as liking and subscribing. So there's a little bit of the history of England, its Vikings, and the city of London. And throughout everything I was talking about, London was always central. So, and the Normans conquered Ireland. Well, the Normans conquered England too, when you think about it. William the Conqueror in 1066, which basically stops the Viking invasion. So that's considered the end of the Viking Age. Yeah. Hey, good to see you, Seth. Great to see you. Yeah, I would love it if we get a good question from a troll. Dublin snob. Duke of Wellington was born in Dublin. He helped in defeating Napoleon. Yes, the Duke of Wellington, extremely important. Obviously, we get the food beef Wellington from him, but basically, and I believe Wellington is in New Zealand. I think he was given that title because of his victories against Napoleon. I'm trying to remember his actual name. But basically, the Duke of Wellington is the English commander and field marshal, along with Field Marshal Blucher of the Prussians, who was able to defeat Napoleon when Napoleon came back after being exiled the first time. He rallied a bunch of forces around him and wanted to attack the Prussians, Austrians, Russians, and British before they could get organized. But he ran into resistance at what is now the Belgian city, the Belgian in Belgium. At the city and at the place, the town of Waterloo, Napoleon is finally and firmly defeated by Field Marshal Blucher, who really backs up the English, led by obviously Wellington, who becomes the Duke of Wellington for all of his successes. And Napoleon is finally defeated thanks to an Irishman. So thank you very much for that, Dublin. I just learned that the French do not call it Waterloo. I think they call it Saint-Jean or something like that. Global saying the people invaded by UK would use different terms to speak of imperial history. Well, yeah, obviously the English, interestingly enough, what I just pointed out, Global, and I absolutely agree, and I think you're right, is that what I just mentioned is colonization and invasion. England itself being a victim of that, the Great Britain and the UK being a victim of that for many, many years by the French, by the Vikings, by different Germanic tribes and groups. That's why English is a language that is not firmly based in Latin like French, Spanish, and Italian, but takes from Latin as well as German and French. I mean, for instance, when the Normans conquered England, that's why there's different words in English for different types of meat. So pig meat is called pork because of the French words. The English adapted from the French a lot of different terminology for their food as well as their culture, and 60% of English words have some sort of French basis, which obviously goes back to the Latin, the Romance languages and all of that. But England was a victim of colonization and imperialism many times in its own history, and karma is a common thing in history. History doesn't rhyme, but it repeats itself, as Mark Twain likes to say. And so the English really perpetuate that in the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries, starting in the United States. You could argue they started in Ireland, really, in the 1600s, although they've been colonizing Ireland for centuries with much resistance, but they firmly integrate Ireland in the 1640s. Obviously, you have the American Revolution over levying taxes that they didn't believe Parliament was able to levy. You have Canada. You have the oppression of the First Peoples in Canada, the Indigenous Aboriginal peoples of Canada being oppressed by the British Empire. And of course, maybe the biggest example of British oppression, the most ongoing one at least, is the country of India, which the British started colonizing in the 1600s. Using regional leaders called Rajas, pitting them against each other and absorbing more resources, more land, and more influence, making Indians work for them at dirt poor wages. When they raised the taxes on the American colonies at a low rate, they jacked up the taxes on the Indian colonies that they had just won in the 7 Years' War by much higher rates. So high taxes, racist behavior, oppression, lack of self-government, this idea that you need to civilize these people because they're not good enough to run their own country, which eventually becomes known as social Darwinism, this idea that white Anglo-Saxon peoples are racially superior and therefore have a duty and an obligation to civilize and educate and build up the infrastructure of the lands they colonize, be those India or Australia with the Aboriginal peoples there, And in Africa, that becomes predominant during the late 19th century with not just the British, but the British are obviously one of the biggest, British are the biggest empire in the world, so they're going to have the most amount of colonization, the most amount of oppression, and the most amount of discrimination because of that colonization. And that really is a problem that isn't even fully resolved to this day. Many of the problems in Africa and India and in other places of the world are because of British imperialism and the imperialism of other European forces. And when the British left many of these African places, power vacuums emerged where militant groups went in and kleptocracies were created where basically high-ranking military officials, generals, and other peoples basically stole as much as they possibly could and sapped up as much of the power and resources in the country as possible, leaving everyone else out in the cold, which led to untold amounts of suffering in Africa and in Asia. So the British have that blood on their hands. Not fully their fault. I don't think you could say that today the problems in Ghana and Kenya are fully because the British colonized those areas. But there's a trace and a legacy of that colonization that continues to hurt the Ghanaians and the Kenyans and other people in Africa and Asia as well. So, yeah, global. It's a mixed bag. There's one society being oppressed, and then it turns around and oppresses another, and that's almost common. Yeah, Otter. Basically, Henry Ford puts Detroit on the map. Basically, everyone wants to copy Henry Ford. In 1913, he invents his assembly line, which basically allows the fast production of machinery. So for the previous century, before Henry Ford and a little bit longer, you'd had the Industrial Revolution where you have factories being able to produce things at a much quicker pace than they'd ever been produced before, using steel, iron, and steam to be able to do this, as well as coal. So these things were transforming the world. Industries build up, pollution builds up, people move to the cities, wages increase, stratification of labor increases. But Henry Ford is going to add another gear when he invents the assembly line, because now no longer are you working on one whole car for hours at a time, but in the assembly line you're working on one part of the automobile at a time instead of. And so Jim and Bob, who were previously working on putting together an entire car, now Jim is doing the bumper and the body, and Bob is doing the engine and the lights. And so all of a sudden you have, instead of two guys having to do 100 things, you have one guy doing 25, one guy doing 25, one guy doing 25, one guy doing 25. And you have one part being made here, then it moves on to another part where another part is made there. The assembly line is very much in focus today. It's still used today. A lot of the times the machines that are built on the assembly line are then used to build more things on the assembly line. Robots and mechanization is increasing dramatically in the digital age that we live in today. But basically, Henry Ford makes it a lot quicker to produce cars. Therefore, he is able to increase the supply of cars. He is able to meet the demand of cars. And as the supply increases, economics teaches us, the prices decrease. Prices originally, when the supply increases, prices go up. But then as demand increases, prices start to go down. So all of a sudden, you can make a automobile much quicker and for much cheaper, and Ford is able to do this successfully, and he gets the Model A, the Model T, which is the Model A, and then the Model T, which becomes the car to have, and he basically builds up an entire city. In Detroit, you have obviously all of his factories, all of his workers are there, and they're obviously, because of the rapid production and the growth of the Ford Motor Company, they're able to gain more and more wealth. They're able to specialize in what part or piece they are going to assemble. And so all of a sudden, they have more wealth. They have more disposable income. They're going to move up. There's economic opportunities for them. And you see a growth and emergence of a middle class because of this. So the more cars that are produced, the more money the company makes, and the more it can continue to expand and grow, and the more labor increases in its value, and the more the laborers see in wages. And also, you have this followed up by other companies like GM and Chevrolet and all of these places that want to kind of copy what Ford is doing. And so the assembly line doesn't just become the practice for the Ford Motor Company, but for General Motors, and for Chevrolet, and all of a sudden, by the 1930s and 40s and onward, Detroit, which is now known as the Motor City, Motown, Motor City, has been built up by Ford and rival competitors who are all using the assembly line to. They're all experiencing great amounts of production, large amounts of wealth, and more job creation. And so the assembly line changes the motor industry. It changes the way all machinery is produced. It makes it a lot quicker and easier. It increases the value of labor, but it also helps build cities because all of a sudden, people who had already been moving to cities are targeting moving to work for Ford or GM, and Ford and GM center themselves in Detroit. So Henry Ford basically transforms an entire city and the entire way we do business and look at the creation of machinery and products in this country just with his invention of the assembly line. Americans get that wrong all the time. It's Worcestershire, right? I hope I'm saying it, Simon. It's a hard one to pronounce. Anyways, Louis, evening to you as well. Yes, the British definitely have the greatest navy in the entire world, and the navy is what kept them afloat, no pun intended, for as long as it did. And the navy is what the Germans were trying to crack in both world wars and couldn't quite do it. And the English Navy is actually created by King Henry VIII, who was such a wild card in history and so highly judged, hurt, and hated by so many people, but also beloved for a lot of things he did. He's such an interesting and enigmatic figure, and obviously he does a lot of crazy stuff like murdering 2 of his wives, leaving the Church of England so he can get a divorce and leaving the Catholic Church so he can get a divorce and a lot of money. But his biggest contribution to England is not any of the history that he's really known for. It is the creation of the Royal Navy, which really sees an uptick following the defeat of the Spanish Armada and Elizabeth I. In the 17th century, the English did not have the greatest navy. That was the Dutch. In the 16th century, it was the Spanish. In the 15th century, it was the Portuguese. But by the 18th and 19th centuries, especially with their victories against Napoleon and in the 7 Years' War, the English build up a real huge armada that is able to protect their trade interests. It's able to consolidate their economic and military power, and it allows them to go to farther places and to build their empire much more quickly. The British also, speaking of the Industrial Revolution, are the first to get industrialization in their textile industry, which is able to produce their value and wealth. The French because of the French Revolution, the French are held back from it, so it's actually the Americans who are right behind them. But because the British start off the Industrial Revolution, because it really begins in England, and the creation of factories are in England, and the end of mercantilism and the beginning of capitalism really can be traced to England in the mid to late 18th century, you see the fact that England is able to get ahead, and of course they also have the Navy, the best and brightest Navy in the world, and no one can really challenge them there, so they're able to have a foothold on geopolitics throughout most of the 19th century. Yep. Thank you. Make the most of it. Your questions, your topics, what you bring up is superb. And you are superb. So thank you for joining us. I don't know much about King Elia. I don't know much about Irish history during pre-Roman, Christianization, you could say. Yes, the Vikings went to Ireland a lot, and they get there a lot, and they do a lot in Dublin. Make the most of it is Canute, who demonstrated his non-godly status by showing how he could not command the tide. Yes, supposedly he was insane, and he kind of snapped, and he went to the sea and told, oh, that's not it. I'm thinking of Caligula. Caligula made war against the sea god Poseidon, what the Romans called Neptune, because he was, crazy. But make the most of it, yes. So Canute was this really powerful political figure, and he actually has a better reputation in Norway and Sweden and Denmark, which is what he controlled, the North Sea Empire, before he gets to England. And apparently people thought he was so great that he could command the waves, but he actually took all of his forces out to the sea one day and tried to make the oceans move. And when they wouldn't move, he proved to his people that he wasn't invincible and all-powerful. Hello, welcome. Thank you for joining us, Dave. Strathclyde Brittonic Kingdom, covering what is now northwest England and southwest Scotland. I know a little bit about it. I know that you've got you have Strathclyde, you have the Picts, Scotland, because of different tribes that were able to flee into the hinterlands and the highlands against the Romans throughout because the Romans tried several times to conquer Scotland and failed. Because of the ability to flee into the highlands, because you had different Celtic tribes that were separate from the Britons, who the Romans were able to conquer in the south. Scotland was able to remain a distinct political identity. And I know a little bit about how there was a kingdom of Picts. I think the Jutes, were they called Jutes? Who controlled what is now Northumbria and Scotland, and they swore fealty in the late 9th century or late 10th or early 10th century to the English. So, yeah, I do my best to pronounce as correctly as possible. I speak Spanish, so I work very hard on my pronunciation. And when you learn more languages, pronunciation across languages becomes easier in my experience. So, that makes sense. Anglo and Irish. Well, Churchill, obviously everyone thinks of Churchill as a British figure, and he certainly is, but his mother was an American. And Churchill is actually descended from a woman, Elizabeth Churchill, who was the lover of Queen Anne. Queen Anne, who is the queen, interestingly enough, when England and Scotland are united in 1707, despite having many children with her husband, George was more akin to be interested in women. And one of her lovers was Elizabeth Churchill, who was an ancestor of Winston Churchill. So Churchill's got quite an interesting history on his own, and there are plenty of amazing British figures who are mixed-blooded between English and Scottish and Irish. And you obviously have conquest, intermarrying, diplomatic relations, migration between these regions all the time. So it's easy for someone to be English, Scottish, Irish, Welsh, to check all the boxes and just say that they're British, basically. Global saying Magna Carta, June 1215, was the first document to put into writing the principle that the king and the government was not above the law. Yes, definitely. And I did a video on that. The Magna Carta is extremely important. It's the first document in European history and Western history that says the king is not above the law, and the king has to answer to God just like we all do, and the king can be put on trial if he can violate the law, and the king cannot just tax whenever he wants. He has to be. This is the first inklings of what the Americans will later call the consent of the governed. Basically, the Magna Carta's history is fascinating to me. King John, known as John Lackland, the worst English king in history, the king who is reviled in the Robin Hood legends, became king after his brother Richard died without any heirs. Richard was too busy fighting in the Crusades to, propagate a family. But John becomes the king in 1199, and he is being hammered by the French king Philippe II, better known as Philippe Augustus. And when you are named after the Roman Emperor Augustus, you know you're a great monarch. And Philippe Augustus, was able to basically take over huge areas of France that the English had previously controlled, such as Anjou, most of Normandy, and large parts of Aquitaine. This Angevin Empire of John's father, Henry II, which included Anjou in central France, Normandy in northwestern France, and Aquitaine in southwestern France, was being eviscerated by Philip II. And basically, John fought war after war, failed, and basically told his nobles and barons, I can get, resources from you whenever I please. Give me them so I can raise my army and send off your peasants' children to die in my armies. This obviously was not popular with the nobles. Obviously, the fact that John kept losing and there was no wealth being gained, there was no titles being gained, there was no prestige for them in France because he was losing land, which is why they called him John Lackland, obviously upset them. John also had horrible relations with the Catholic Church. The Pope at the time, probably the most famous and strongest in all of history, Innocent III, who was not so innocent, basically told John that he wasn't going to allow church services anymore because he continued to make wars with the French. And John continued to ignore the Pope, so much so that he eventually had to turn over his lands to the Pope and basically say that England was under control from the papacy. It gets so bad between John and the church and John and his nobles that eventually they call a meeting in 1215 and they create a great charter, Magna Carta. And it basically says that the king is not above the law and they can no longer be taxed, and they have to give him approval for when he can collect wealth or funds from him. And the Pope actually strikes it down, and several times throughout the reign of John's son, Henry III, they will have to keep bringing back the Magna Carta and reinstituting the charter and making certain agreements about it. And the king and the nobles will continue to say to the king, you can't do whatever you want. And kings like Henry III and Edward I will say, we can do whatever we want, but what do you say? And so there's this back and forth and give and take for the next 50 years until eventually they make it permanent in the late 1200s. under John's grandson, Edward Longshanks, who I already mentioned. And Edward Longshanks, or Edward the First, basically would get together his nobles, and since they were Normans, they were the descendants of William the Conqueror. Since they were Normans and they spoke French in the royal court rather than English, they would parley. They would discuss political terminology, taxes, and warfare. And so the group that met was the House of Lords, and they would parley, and that was what became known. The group became known as Parliament. And then you had a group representing knights, vassals, landowners, and merchants, and they became the House of Commons. So the idea, the first beginnings of Parliament, the first beginnings of the fact that the king does not have unchecked power in European history, and of course this influences American history and most of Western democracy over the last 5 centuries, comes from the Magna Carta and comes from John Lackland, who didn't want to sign the Magna Carta but had to because he was so unpopular, so weak, and so hated. Simon the Bunny saying friendly history. History is a foreign country with different languages, customs, and culture. You say something like this outlook. Yeah, I love this outlook. Yeah, I love it too. It's not my original words. It comes from one of my professors in college, but basically the past is a foreign country with all sorts of different cultures and ideas. And so when you visit a foreign country, they have customs and languages that you're not familiar with. And when you open a history book and you read about a particular people group, it may be in your very own country, but you should consider them a foreign country because their practices and beliefs and ideas are so much different than your own. So like you would when you go traveling, learn from that country, don't stand in judgment over it. Yes, make the most of it. Words ending able. Yes. And meant. So gouvernement is the French word for government. 90% of the Saxon gentry were replaced by Normans. Yeah, William the Conqueror takes over in 1066, and he basically says he spends the rest of his reign consolidating his power, and the best way to consolidate his power is to kick out all the Anglo-Saxons who fought against him previously and replace them with Normans who are loyal to him. And in order to make himself more powerful and to show that he means business and that he is a fierce ruler and a warlord more than a king, he builds fortresses and towers. One of his fortresses he builds is the Tower in London, or the Tower of London. It is a fortress built by William the Conqueror, I think in 1071. Roald Dahl, author of Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. Matilda passed away. Yes. 34 years ago today, that was in my passed away. Also, speaking of English history, Perkin Warbeck, a pretender to the English throne in the late 1400s, who was very handsome and charismatic but didn't have enough support and was eventually hung for trying to run away from prison. He also died on this day in 1499. That's interesting, Dublin. That's fascinating that he had high-ranking Irish generals. It would make sense given the Catholic connection and the anti-English connection. Sebastian, welcome. Hey, that's a great question. Hey, what is your 3 favorite historic events? Oh, geez. One of them, I'm not going to put them in any particular order because it's hard to pick, but one of them is definitely when Napoleon has the audacity to declare the French Empire, and instead of letting the Pope crown him like Charlemagne had 1,000 years before, he crowns himself the emperor and then takes the ever crown and puts it on Josephine's head in that famous painting. I think that's obviously one of the biggest and most important events in history. It shows the change of Europe. It shows the impact of the French Revolution, and it shows how autocracy gains power, and it shows the absolute hubris of people like Napoleon, but also the absolute daring and boldness of one of history's most important and interesting figures. So that's one for me, the Napoleon crowning himself. I also look at, let's see, some other ones that are really particularly interesting. I think you have the, oh boy, because I'm going down the line here. I think obviously a huge one, I think my particular emphasis being in Russian history, I think a huge one is Peter the Great coming to the throne in 1696 in Russia, and building St. Petersburg in 1703. That obviously changes Russia, makes it more of a European country, which everyone is still trying to figure out 300 years later. We haven't solved the question of Russia's European identity or lack thereof in over 300 years, and that all starts because Peter the Great wanted to emulate the Europeans, so he decided to build a westernized city, a new capital, St. Petersburg, in 1703 on the Baltic. Those are 2 really important ones. And I think a third one, let me see here. I'm trying to think because there's so many different historic events that are really important to me. I think the foundation of the let me see here. I think the fall of Constantinople at the hands of the Ottoman Turks would have to be up there. Not that I'm favorite as in most interesting. I'm not saying that I love these things that happen. I just find them to be particularly interesting. Byzantine Eastern Roman learning and influence takes its way to Europe and influences the Renaissance. Obviously, the Ottoman Empire is going to become one of the biggest existential threats to Europe and one of the biggest superpowers of the early modern period. They're obviously going to conquer basically all of southeastern Europe, which is called the Balkans. They're going to conquer Greece. They are going to become the descendants and inheritors to the Islamic Caliphate of Muhammad by conquering Mecca and Medina. They're going to conquer all of North Africa and Egypt. They're going to have this huge cultural and historical impact. They are the ones that basically throw the Christians out of the Middle East and out of Turkey permanently. And through all the different Turkic groups like the Go-Turks and the Seljuks that had tried to influence and control the Muslim world, no one did it nearly as successfully as the Ottomans. They were wealthy, they were cosmopolitan, they loved to trade. Even though the Europeans hated them because they were Muslim, many of the Europeans, like the French and Venetians, made treaties with them so they could trade and garner from them their cultural and political power and, of course, their economic wealth. They would control trading on the Dardanelles and in the Eastern Mediterranean and most of the Mediterranean for centuries to come. And their decline is only because of the spirit of nationalism that inspired the European countries of southeastern Europe. And despite the fact that they were oppressive, like many empires are, there was actually a decent amount of religious toleration, cosmopolitanism, and cultural development in the Ottoman Empire, particularly in its first few centuries. So sultans like Mehmet the Great and Muhammad II, men like this were not only great leaders. Suleiman the Magnificent, they were not only great leaders, but they were also extremely interested in the arts, extremely interested in culture and learning, education and philosophy. And so the Ottomans are going to be extremely powerful, and you don't have the development of Russia's influence and power in southeastern Europe without the Ottoman threat that they're constantly fighting. You don't have the development of a Catholic Holy League, where the Habsburgs are going to gain a huge amount of power in Central Europe and, of course, in Spain, which creates the Spanish Empire without the Ottomans. And I would argue you're not going to have Columbus without the Ottomans. Columbus was going west to get to India. The Portuguese knew that you could go east to go around the Cape of Good Hope at the bottom of Africa. The reason they were trying to do this, they were trying to find quick and easy ways to access potential trade partners and allies in the East, in China, in Japan, and India. And that's what they do, and they go on these different routes around the bottom of Africa, west to what becomes the Americas, to get away from the Ottomans, because they don't want the Ottoman middleman to be taxing their goods, monitoring their trade, and harassing them as they try to get goods and supplies and establish communications and relations with India and China. For centuries, the Europeans had this belief that either in Africa or Asia, there was a Christian kingdom with ancient roots to the apostles that would be ready to help them defeat the Muslims. There was a man named Prester John. The Europeans basically believed that this guy, Prester John, was a king in Africa somewhere, and if they just found him, he would help them defeat the Muslims once and for all and overthrow the Ottomans. So in the desire to go around the Ottomans and skirt by them and snub them, they tried to find passages to westward and northwest, the Northwest Passage, to get to India and China and Japan and Malaysia and all of these areas. So because the Ottomans take over, destroy the Byzantines, destroy the Eastern Roman Empire in 1453, which many people consider to be the end of the Roman Empire once and for all, because of that, you have Europeans going on different alternative routes to try to trade and reach India and the East and all of those goods, rather than relying on the Silk Road as they had for centuries before, which goes from the Middle East through Central Asia all the way to China, which the Romans had used. So the Ottoman conquest and the Ottoman Empire is extremely strong and influential And I think that that is one of the most important events in human history. Maybe I listed what I think are the three most important, but they're definitely some of my favorites to learn about because history is not without cause and effect. And because of this cause, the Ottomans taking over, you have the effect of the rise of Russia in Eastern Europe. You have the rise of the Habsburgs. You have the rise of the Spanish Empire because of those alternate trade routes are going to take Columbus to the west and the Indies, the West Indies, and of course, North and South America. So, great question. I really appreciate that, Sebastian. The British were forced out of India after forcing the Indians to be ruled by them for centuries, first under the East India Company, then under the British. The British also divide up Bangladesh, India, and Pakistan, which has caused huge amounts of problems. Basically, the British decide that a Muslim majority population and a non-Muslim majority population should be divided from each other so there's not problems between Muslims and non-Muslims. For centuries, the Hindus and Muslims of the Indian subcontinent had very little tolerance for each other, and it was only the strength of the Mughal emperors of the 16th and 17th century that had kept the Indians in line from all-out civil war. But continual violence by both sides prompted the British to divide India and Pakistan. And Bangladesh comes along for the ride, being another Muslim majority country. And obviously that leads to the dispute over the land of Kashmir, part of it being controlled by Pakistan, part of it being controlled by India. So you have that. And of course, the British are going to do this more than once. They divide up Palestine between the Palestinian Arabs and different Arab migrant groups and Bedouins, and obviously the Jews, which is where we get the set of problems we have there today. I'm not going to blame the British for everything. I think it's very easy to blame an imperial system, and I've heard many people ever since the war started between Israel and Hamas try to blame Great Britain for this, and I think that's really stupid. I think I shouldn't say stupid. It's historically, at least partially, pretty ignorant. The British are not fully responsible for all of this. It makes sense to want to divide people groups that are just going to beat the heck out of each other as best you can. And the British certainly try to do that in India, in the Indian subcontinent, and in Palestine, in the Levant. Interestingly enough, India is called India because of the Indus River Valley, which is all in Pakistan. The Ganges is the most important river in the country of India. So because of this, nationalist movements, I'm trying to remember the name of the current prime minister in India. He is very interested in basically creating, renaming India to get it away from the Indus River Valley and to make it more distinct from the Pakistanis. And I think it's Bharat is the ancient Sanskrit name for India. And so they are considering changing India's name. So if you're enjoying what you're hearing, if you're liking the topics I'm talking about, please be sure to drop a comment or a question about a particular historical thing you'd like to learn more about. Like and subscribe. It really helps the channel to grow. Time Exit, you're too kind. I appreciate you being here. Thank you. Yes, the Amritsar Massacre of 1919. A lot of people don't know about this massacre, but basically, following World War I, where so many Indians fought and died for the British Empire, the Indian independence movement, the Indian National Congress, which is eventually led by a man named Mohandas Gandhi, does its absolute best to try to demand independence and civil rights. The British stamped them out brutally. Throughout the 1920s, we often think of the 20s as the Jazz Age and the Age of Prohibition. We're thinking completely American. Or we think of the Weimar Republic in Germany. We don't think about what's going on in Japan, or in China, or in India. In China, Jiang Shi, which is what the Chinese call him, the Americans called him Chiang Kai-shek, is going to replace Sun Yat-sen and lead the nationalist movement in an effort to take over all of China, kick out the warlords, and eviscerate the Communist Party and other radicals, which is eventually going to lead to the Long March and the Civil War between Mao and the Communists and the Nationalists with Chiang Kai-shek. Japan is going to start, because of political and economic decline, is going to embrace militaristic power, just like the Italians will with Mussolini. But what's interesting is that in India, independence movements are going very strong and becoming more and more loud, and the British, the way they take care of it, is by suppressing them. And this is because they want to hold on to their empire. In 1922, the British give up Southern Ireland. The same year, Afghanistan, who has been since the Second Anglo-Afghan War in the 1870s, tells the British to get out, and they leave. And so Afghanistan is no longer part of the British sphere of influence. Ireland becomes independent, and despite their acquisitions in the Middle East after defeating the Ottomans in World War I, which was the death nail in the Ottoman Empire, by the way, the British are really are now starting to worry. They're starting to feel self-conscious about their empire. And the Americans, especially thanks to Woodrow Wilson and later presidents, are going to continue to put pressure on the British to honor self-determination, democracy, and allow these people to eventually have their own independence. And so there's going to be a slow but steady movement. It's going to be very violent at first, and then Gandhi's going to come in and promote more nonviolent measures that are really going to bring attention throughout the entire world. Because when you see that, you have a nonviolent movement that is asking for peace and the ability to lead themselves, and you're supposed to be a Western liberal democracy, and you're suppressing that, you're going to look like the bad guy. So Gandhi, through a tortoise rather than hare approach, is going to slowly but surely undo the British control of India. Because when you're fighting for independence in violent ways, you're going to look very militant and perhaps even like a terrorist group. But Gandhi knows that the British would not dare to violently repress, even though they try, to violently repress a peaceful movement like the Indian National Congress of the 1930s and 40s. And due to pressures from the United States to be a free and independent, to be a free, peace-loving, democratic-loving country, and West in the face of the Soviet Union at the end of World War II, the British eventually let India go free thanks to Gandhi's efforts in 1947. And the efforts of a man named Jawaharlal Nehru, who becomes the first Prime Minister of India. So, yes, I do know stuff about non-Western countries. Dublin saying, India is more of a religious conflict. I don't think the British Empire would have made any difference. Not quite. I wouldn't fully agree, because the Mughals, despite being a Muslim country, a Muslim empire, are able to maintain some level of respect and power. So did the Delhi Sultanate over the Indian people, who are majority Hindu. And then you have the development of Sikhism, you have Jewish and Christian communities that are very small, but you have ancient Jainism, and you have Hinduism and Islam, the two largest religions, duking it out. But there is some level of stability and control. But as that power system breaks down and the colonization becomes more and more rampant, the violence between Hindu and Muslim starts to escalate once again. Worcestershire, yep. I think I said it right. Make the most of it. I believe his horse fell and had to do a sudden change in temperament. He was, make the most of it. You're referring to Henry VIII. Yeah, he fell on his horse in a jousting accident. Henry was actually extraordinarily athletic, good-looking, intelligent, artistic. He loved to write poetry. He actually, before the Protestant Reformation, wrote an entire defense of Catholicism and still practiced the Catholic Mass until his death, despite the fact that he is the one that took England away from Catholicism. But he had no affinity for Protestants. He didn't care about Protestantism. But yes, he changed his temperaments, became far more restricted, and he became far more obese and far more corpulent and mean-spirited after his accident. And then he came down with gout and potentially syphilis, which also hampered his mood. Obviously, didn't make him feel any better. Yeah. But yeah, Henry VIII definitely has, there's two Henry VIIIs at least in history, and there might be more. He's one of the most polarizing and maniacal people in all of history. You know, many think UK taught funny. Yeah, I don't, Everyone has an accent, Global. I'm going to go with that. Deus Vult from Moses, which is actually not pronounced Deus Vult, it's Deus Vult. V in Latin is W, just like W in German is V. Like not Werner Herzog, Werner Herzog. That's my best German. But yes, Deus Vult is the statement, or Deus Vult is the statement made by Pope Urban II in 1095, which called the First Crusade, which got the ball rolling for international holy wars between the Muslims and the Christians that some have argued have never stopped even to this day. Blood Eagle. Yes, King Elia died from Blood Eagle. Yes. Are you talking about the guy from Northumbria? I think I know who you're talking about. But Blood Eagle was or Spread Eagle. I think it's called Spread Eagle. Basically, the Vikings were notoriously violent. They were notoriously cruel. And when they would pillage and raid, they would take as much as they possibly could and then leave. They were actually, a lot of Vikings did stay in Scandinavia and try to farm and survive. But pillaging was actually a way for them to survive because they didn't have because of harsh winters, they didn't have as much arable land, and their climate wasn't favorable to them. So raiding was a way for them to get supplies and money that they could use to purchase necessities and like shelter and food. But they were notorious. But the Vikings who did go and raid, which is where the term comes from, Vikinger, raiders, were very, very violent and very, very aggressive. And the spread eagle or blood eagle, that might be another term for it, in order to intimidate their enemies, particularly those who had scorned them or refused to go along with their terms, they would, it's going to be gross and graphic, and I don't want to get censored, but I'll describe it in most PG way possible. They would take someone, they would rip open their chest, they would pull the ribs over to make the form of an eagle. It was a way to eviscerate, humiliate, and brutalize them. And then, of course, they would put them on display because medieval torment often involved display where people would be, their limbs would be severed, their joints would be pulled apart, they would lose their heads, and it was all a way to show this is what happens when you screw with us, so don't do it. The ancient Assyrians had a similar method where they had put someone on top of a stake when somebody had offended or broken their laws to show the entire world that this was their enemy who had rebelled against them. The Greeks and the Romans will refine this, and the Romans will perfect it into what we call crucifixion. So the crucifixion of Jesus of Nazareth is actually a public form of punishment to embarrass and humiliate someone who had tried to mess with the Romans. The Vikings did a similar thing with the blood eagle. Drawing and quartering is what they called it in medieval Europe, where somebody, and they did it until the last couple centuries, where they would pull someone's joints, basically rip someone apart and send their limbs all over the countryside to show that they were the enemy and they would sometimes put their head on display as well. Just really, really nasty, aggressive stuff. But this is why we call it barbaric to some extent. And this was to intimidate potential rebels or threats to security, or anyone who would dare spurn their demands. And that's the Romans did it, the Assyrians did it, the British did it. It is part of human history to not only defeat your enemy, but violently and often grotesquely scorn them and put them on display. I would say King Henry was an empire builder. He increased England's involvement in Ireland. He built up the navy. He obviously didn't make the British Empire, but he is part of its story. Make the most of it. Interesting. I don't know about Ragnar. So Ragnar is another king who was thrown into a lot of things. Again, a way to torture your enemy and make them suffer as much as possible. Really, really gory, nasty ways to die. Yeah, make the most of it. You're talking about John and Henry. I think I'm way behind in the comments and questions, so I'm going to have to speed round it because we're over an hour. But yeah, basically, Henry II, known as Henry Curtmantle, is given this huge empire that controls all of central France, all of England, and Scotland and Ireland and Wales swear fealty to him. So he controls basically all of the British Isles, at least influentially. He also is the one who first puts England into Ireland. And he has huge control and influence. And of course, he has all these lands in France, and he might be more influential and powerful than the French king at the time. Who, by the way, the French king's wife, Eleanor of Aquitaine, had left and married Henry and given him Aquitaine in southwestern France, a province, a region, which had made Henry that strong and that powerful. So not only was he powerful, but he was on the right side of a cuckold. And so Henry was extremely powerful and influential, but his wife, who was very duplicitous, but also extremely influential and important, Eleanor of Aquitaine, influences his sons, who already are power-hungry enough. He has a guy named Henry, the young king. He has a son named Geoffrey, and he has a son named Richard, and all three of them at different points and periods are going to fight civil wars and raise rebellions against him for the last 20 years of his reign. He's going to be able to defeat all of them, and then the French are going to attack. He's going to be able to defeat them. He basically puts out fires the last 15 years of his reign, and at the very end, right before he's about to die, his son Richard, the only one left other than his youngest John, raises a revolt against him again. he puts it down, but he is shocked to learn that John is actually helping Richard. So every one of his sons, one time or another, turns on him. And the only way he ever gets peace is because both Geoffrey and Henry die, and Richard and him make an uneasy peace so that Richard can become the next king. And then Richard doesn't have any children, so John becomes king. But Henry II has it really hard in English history, and maybe has the most amount of betrayal in human history when you consider a monarch and his sons. Dublin, the original inhabitants of the British Isles or Celtic peoples came first from... Yes, that makes sense. Oliver, can you explain the Chechens War? I don't know what you mean by that. I'm not sure. I think of several things when I hear that word. Excuse me. Yeah. Yeah, the hammer of the Scots, Malleus Scortorium. Yeah, Edward I wants you to know one thing, and Mel Gibson wants you to know it in Braveheart. He hated the Scots. I mean, he steals the Stone of Scone, which is this stone that is their national symbol. He basically decides that he is the King of England, and he puts the stone, which is supposed to be like almost like an Arthurian Excalibur-like thing, under his throne to show that he is in control of Scotland, and he actually pretty much, without contest, is. Yes, thank you, Underboss. I appreciate the great exposure. Kindness is free. You're the best. This history knowledge is free. It's just liking and subscribing is all I request, and I don't even try to force it. Yes, Lambert Simbrel, the other pretender, was employed by Henry VII in his court somehow. Yeah, Henry VII is an interesting character that I don't think I've been talking about a lot of English history, but I don't think we know, we give him enough credit. I've been reading this extremely good book by, I know I've shown this before, Lucy Wooding. I've been busy, so I haven't gotten to a lot of it, but she really paints Henry VII in a very positive light, and I don't know if I fully agree, but he's a very powerful king. He basically takes power, does everything he can to hold on to it, and continually is self-conscious about the fact that he basically just stole the throne from the king by killing him and claiming he was illegitimate, Richard III. And so his reign is unstable, but England is actually very wealthy and strong when he dies. And Henry VIII is the one who really makes the English, the writers and the poets and the minstrels turn against his father, and that's why historians have considered Henry VII to be a bad king, when actually the newer evidence that's coming out is that Henry VII was pretty successful. But yeah, Henry VII is always having to deal with the question of who will try to overthrow him, because he was once in those positions. So he's dealing with that, what I'm going to call historic karma. And in his case, karma is not his God. Karma is not the breeze through his hair on the weekend. Could you look into Chief Justice Okororu in Nigeria and give me your thoughts at a later live? Not only will I look into him, I will look into him tonight, and come back tomorrow. And I know I'm doing my live stream lecture from 1 to 2 o'clock Pacific time. But come tomorrow, and I will share, look into him a little bit and share some thoughts at the very end of the live stream, Underboss. It'd be great to see you, and I appreciate you spreading the word. That's your reward for that. Yeah, the Chechnya civil, yeah, Russia basically, that's it. I think you might have misspelled it, but basically there's a war in Chechnya. Russia doesn't want to recognize Chechnya's independence and suppresses them. And this is where Putin, the first example of Putin flexing his muscles and saying that he is not going to, he is going to try to rebuild the Soviet power and influence that he admired. Yeah, geopolitics is fascinating, Simon, and I think at the end of the day, it comes down to the fact that Vladimir Putin is a Russian nationalist, and for him, he doesn't see the Soviet Union, Stalin, Brezhnev, these men as mistakes. He sees them as models. And I think he has a completely different understanding of how geopolitics works than Western Europe and the United States, which are still riding this high of we are the best, we are superior, we beat the communists. And Putin, I don't think, is a communist, but I think that he knows enough about Russian history to have a huge love of the church and traditional Russian culture. To be, he's not he has kind of gone away from being a communist, but this guy worked for the KGB. He's a Russian nationalist to the extreme. He wants to, I hate I'm saying this, make Russia great again, and he wants to do it. And he wants to do it by basically pretending that what happened in the late '80s and early '90s never really happened, or was at least a very big mistake. And I think he sees that he has no other choice because he thinks Russia will decline if he doesn't. Yes, global, that's true. The Vatican Catholic Church has done a lot of nasty stuff, and a lot of people have done a lot of nasty stuff in the name of the Catholic Church in the colonization of the New World and the Americas. However, one thing that's quite interesting is that the Vatican And if you study the history, Bartolomé de las Casas, the priests were almost always on the side of the natives, almost always condemning the acts of the conquistadors. But when you don't have the weapons or the gold, you're at their service and their beck and call. So the priests didn't have full political control. And if you look at the history of medieval and early modern Europe, particularly with the Catholic Church and countries that stayed Catholic, there's always this tension: political ambitions, greed, economic opportunities versus what is the church going to say and do, and how is the church going to work with this? I mean, the Pope basically let Mussolini do what he wanted because the Pope, Mussolini gave the Pope his own country, Vatican City, in the 1920s. That's where Vatican City comes from, by the way. And that was after the first Italians in the 1860s had taken away the papal states, which for centuries had been a papal kingdom. The Pope wasn't just a religious leader, he was a political ruler for centuries in Europe. And I think that's definitely the case in throughout all of Europe and throughout North and South America, where you have the Pope and the Church trying to act in a particular way, and sometimes the political powers and governments are at their will, and sometimes they're at the will of those governments, and sometimes they're working together towards evil, and sometimes they're in great tension with one another. Oliver, why did the USA invade Iraq? I would say that the main ostensible reason is the fear that Saddam Hussein would continue to support terrorism and that he was going to use weapons of mass destruction on his own people, which turned out to be untrue. But it was basically the spirit of exporting democracy through any means necessary, even violence, that turned out not to work. Interesting. Yeah, the church did generally support it because they felt that they could save the souls of the natives. So there is a lot of excuses for colonization, and people use all sorts of reasons to justify bad deeds. My granddad was born. Interesting. Yeah, we talked about this. Yeah, a lone survivor. That's an amazing. Your grandfather is a legend, a total Chad. I need to read it. Yeah, there's a lot more evidence and history coming out about how brutal Stalin actually was during the Holodomor. That makes sense. Yeah, there's a lot of interplay between English and French, so you would see those names be the same. Interesting. Yeah. Well, yes, it does, because the Orthodox Church in Russia, make the most of it, is based on Greek Orthodoxy, which is based on the Greek language. So Demeter becomes Dimitri. Yep, we are coming up on an hour. Make sure to follow me. Simon's putting up all the social media handles, so if you haven't followed me there yet, let me see. I'm trying to pin that comment. Whatever. I can't pin it right now. Anyways, yeah, Dublin, they definitely did bring stability, but what cost? Yes. It's technically the UN that divided it. Britain, yeah, definitely the UN divides it, but Britain is the one who kind of oversees it and said in the Balfour Declaration the Jews had a right to have their own state. Ottomans conquered through religious conversions. Sometimes forced, sometimes pressured. Basically, it was easier to be a Muslim and live in the Ottoman Empire, so a lot of people converted for convenience. West Africa converts to Islam willingly, but mainly because they see the political and economic influence of the Abbasid Caliphate and later the Mamluk Sultanate. Oh, that's really fascinating. Indian and Nigerian. Yes, please like, share, all of that good stuff. It really helps the channel grow. I will be sure to do that. Yeah, let me see. Just seeing if I have any more questions here. Thank you guys for all the love and support. Really appreciate all of it. Yeah, there's many different ethnic groups, and you can tell that in India mainly because of all the languages that are spoken in India and all the dialects of the languages. Yep, they did that. So did the Mongols, Yalda. That was common. Put the enemy's bodies on display to show what you do to your enemies. Yeah, Douglas Murray's an interesting guy, to say the least. Henry, none of those people were good people. I don't know if you're saying Henry, as far as a ruler goes, he was an effective ruler. I never said he was a great guy. I don't know what you're saying, Harvey, about Israel, but I totally disagree. If what you're saying, what I think you're saying. Yeah, make the most of it. At the end of the day, it's all about holding on to your throne and not letting anyone challenge you, and sometimes being ruthless, cold, and miserly to do that. Angel A, do you think Trump will emulate Putin? As a historian, I don't see Putin and Trump on the same wavelength. I see them as both nationalists. I see them as different types of nationalists. I don't see them as the buddy buddies that everybody else seems to see them as. I think they have ties. I think there's a lot of respect. I think people who often try to lump Trump in with Putin as, oh, he's just like Putin, he's this or that, are basically giving into conspiracy theories. A good example of this is well, he's never said anything bad about Putin, so that means he likes Putin. That doesn't mean anything. That really doesn't. That is not evidence. The Russian collusion thing really never came to fruition. I think there's definitely Trump has a lot of carrot and stick with Putin, and I think he wants to give more of the carrot than the stick. Yes, Simon. If that's what he's really saying, then that's the perspective he's taking about it. That's true, Global. But Saddam was actually somewhat more open to Western ideas than others, and he wasn't as militant in his Islamism as Iran or Saudi Arabia. Anyway, so it looks like I think I've caught up on all of the questions. Yeah, I don't appreciate any of those comments about Israel. But anyways, I think we've finally caught up on all of the questions. I will take one more from you guys. We've gone 75 minutes, so it's been a longer stream, but an enjoyable one. And if you guys like this, be sure to like, subscribe, tell all your friends and family, share, and spread that information. Chief Justice Okororu. I will not remember that. I will not forget that. And we will be back tomorrow at 4 p.m. Eastern for some more history, live stream lecture about Ellis Island, President Kennedy's life and times, and of course, a little bit of the Thanksgiving story, which I'll be covering in more detail on Wednesday's live stream lecture part 2, just as a Thanksgiving special. But if anyone has any last questions, I will take them, and we will have that, and then we will be good to go. Yes, but Global, you can collect $200. Ooh, this is a good one from Dublin. Was a religious race between Christianity and Islam in converting the new colonies like the Americas before Islam got there, especially the Spanish and Portuguese knew so well? I don't think there was ever really a huge fear that the Muslims would get there. I think the bigger fear by the Europeans in the 16th century, if you look at it, was why they formed the Holy League, why they had such big battles like at Lepanto and Malta, was that the Muslims would destroy Europe and they would have to go through Europe before they got to the Americas, obviously. So I think that's a big question. And they are not taught. I don't know about Volkmard. I don't know what that is, Bingo. But it's not taught as much as it should be, because there's a lot of people just kind of assume everyone knows Stalin was a bad guy. They don't know how many millions of people Stalin killed. 25,000 people a day were starving at the height of the Holodomor in 1932 to 1933 in Ukraine and Russia and Western Russia. So, Vlad Tepes. Yeah, Vlad Tepes. That's we do touch that. I have a video about that. He is the inspiration for Dracula. Putting people on a spike, all that terrible stuff, withstanding the Ottoman pressures and influences in Wallachia, Transylvania, and helping the Hungarians do the same. And make the most of it. You are superb. And I don't share that personal information. Just know that I know what I'm talking about. You guys should know that by now. I really appreciate that, though. I appreciate you for coming, Yalda. It's always great to see you here. Have a great rest of your night, guys. I answered 2 questions instead of 1, but it's a 2-for-1 BOGO. I appreciate all of you, and I will see you tomorrow for our live stream lecture on Ellis Island, JFK, and some of the early history surrounding the Thanksgiving holiday in the United States. Take care and have a great Saturday evening. Bye-bye now.